In a video from a few days ago, I talked about the current state of live services and how many of them are dying off due to the unsustainable nature of the live service oversaturation that expects players will have infinite time and that expects that there'll be infinite players, but in reality, there are a limited number of players with a limited number of time, and live services, given the amount of time that they demand from players with how grindy they are, there's only so many of them that can coexist before the whole genre starts collapsing, and only a few established ones remain. And so we've been seeing live services die off left and right. I listed a number of them in that video, and these are live services that died within the span of weeks. I'm talking about games like Marvel's Avengers, Apex Legends Mobile, Battlefield Mobile, Project Q, Crossfire X, Back 4 Blood, Knockout City, Rumbleverse, Crimeside, Echo VR, Dragon Quest: The Adventure of Dia, Heroes Bonds, Final Fantasy VII, The First Soldier, Babylon's Fall, Dragalia Lost. These are live services that are either shutting down, that are dead, abandoned, or canceled, all within the span of weeks. There's definitely been a reckoning for live services, and one that may potentially be joining that group if it doesn't find a way to spruce things up is Multiversus. This is a game that is essentially Super Smash Bros., but with Warner Bros. Properties, and so the roster looks something like this. It's a pretty fun roster, and when it launched, a lot of people play this game because, they liked the roster, and there were foundational elements of the game that really worked. There were aspects of the fighting mechanics that really resonated with people, but it still had a lot of work left to do. It just didn't have the depth and breadth of content, and content rollout has been slow, which hasn't helped matters. Given the general bare-bones state that it released, and despite a solid foundation, it just had an uphill climb to make. And, well, the Metascore right now, while the Metascore itself is, in a decent place, the user score is sort of mixed, positive leaning, but people acknowledge the issues surrounding just the lack of content and the fact that there were certain refinements that needed to happen. Unfortunately, the updates and the fixes and character additions and content additions, that stuff just hasn't been rolling out at a pace that is adequate, which is why if you go to Steam charts right now and take a look at Multiversus Performance, you'll see that numbers are looking extremely rough right now. Keep in mind that this is a game that launched to high enough players that we delved into the hundreds of thousands when it comes to concurrent players all-time peak, 153,000 all-time peak concurrent players back in July of 2022, and you can see that average players were in the tens of thousands, but that very quickly plummeted into the lower tens of thousands and then into the low thousands before we got into the triple digits, into the hundreds of players. And now you can see right here that the 24-hour peak is sitting at 1,091 players, and as of 24 minutes ago, just a couple hundred players have been playing. This is a far cry from the launch numbers. We're talking about an over 99% drop in players, almost 100% straight up. And this is something that various news outlets have picked up on, including Video Games Chronicle, with an article whose headline reads, Multiversus' daily peak Steam player count has dropped more than 99% since launch. The game dropped below a daily peak of 1,000 players for the first time this week. And this is an article that was published on February 15th, 2023. They actually did the math and provided the exact percentage by which the player base dropped from its peak. This marks a drop in daily peak player count of 99.357% in less than 7 months. Keep in mind that this isn't like Super Smash Bros. Where you buy the game and that's that. Smash Bros. Was a game you bought at full price and released expansions here and there when it comes to character additions, but ultimately, it is very much its own self-contained game that doesn't rely on the live service model, that doesn't need to recurrently monetize constantly for it to be viable. Once the game is sold at that full price, a sale has been made, money has been made, and the recurrent monetization aspect isn't as important for Super Smash Bros., whereas this, Multiversus, is a free-to-play live service that's relying on players engaging with the game and spending money on microtransactions to make its money back. And so seeing numbers dip from an all-time peak of 153,000 players and an average daily players count of over 66,000 players, all the way down to triple digits, that's extremely concerning. Those are critically low player numbers for a live service, a genre that relies on the player base, whose lifeblood is the number of players. And at a certain point, when you cross a certain line of how few players there are, the live service itself just becomes not viable because players can't find matches. They'll have trouble finding people to play with. And on top of that, the game just cannot make enough money. And Video Games Chronicle here does an apt job of explaining exactly why player numbers have dropped so significantly. Part of the reason for the drop in players may be a tepid response to the game's Season 2 content. The first season went super well, saw the release of 5 new characters, Rick, Morty, Gizmo, Stripe, and Black Adam, over the course of around 2 months between late August and late October. But then the second season is where things took a turn for the worse. Season 2 started on November 15th, and since the start of that season, just one character has released, Marvin the Martian, and that was nearly 3 months ago as of the publishing of this February 15th, 2023 article. And it seems as though that's the only character that's going to release for Season 2, a stark contrast from the 5 characters that released in Season 1, which goes to suggest that content rollout is really slowing down, that the developers just aren't able to keep up with the pace of the seasons, and that's just not a good sign. And then to make optics far worse, Season 3 was delayed significantly. It was supposed to start yesterday, February 14th, 2023, as of the publishing of this article, but developer Player First Games delayed it to March 31st. You can see right here the announcement made by Multiversus' Twitter page. We heard you, MVPs. To help you reach the end of the current Battle Pass, players get Battle Pass XP boost items, plus Season 2 is extended to March 31st, and that hit a nerve with people. You can see right here scrolling down, people saying March 31st, they're about to drop an April Fool's the day after too. Nah, this is insanely disappointing news. Please tell us we don't have to wait that long for more content. Please tell us something is coming during Season 2, which has been starved for content. The silence is killing the community. That's another thing. Communication has not been great. No updates are being provided, so it's just hard to be patient. And you can see right here scrolling down that the comments are pretty much all in that vein. They all echo general sentiments that this is just not acceptable. As Video Games Chronicle put it, this has been met with widespread condemnation by players, and you can see that it's right around that time in November when the player base started to drop into the low thousands, though even before then, you can see the player base had been dropping into the thousands. It just goes to suggest that the substance of the game just wasn't reinforced enough by the developers, and people eventually just lost interest because there's so many live services out there and only so many of them can retain so much attention. Again, there's a limited number of players with a limited number of time, and unless your live service stands out in a really major way and is able to compete with what's established right now, the big live services that have been there for years and that kind of set the groundwork, unless your content rollout is consistent, unless the quality is genuinely high, and unless you just find a way to stick out in what is very much an oversaturated market that is going to be unsustainable in the long term, your live service is bound to die. And it seems as though Multiversus, unless it really pulls a fast one on us and just does something major to rekindle the fire that has been lost surrounding this game, it is going to very much end up joining the dozens of live services that I just pointed out. The ones that I covered in this video titled Live Services Are Dying by the Dozen, which is exactly what's happening. The live service bubble is bursting. It doesn't help that the microtransactions people find to be kind of egregious. The monetization system locks off many of its character skins to premium currency. And look, it is a free-to-play game. It has to make its money back somehow, so there's some leniency on microtransactions. But certain skins, like just essentially a gold Superman costing $15, just the pricing versus the quality of skins ratio is not particularly great. And that's on top of Battle Pass and all of these different elements. It's just stuff that people don't want to buy at that price point, and especially when the game's content rollout isn't enough to maintain their attention for them to make players feel invested for the long term, so players are not going to want to invest in something that they feel isn't going to last. And it's a very bad sign for a game that is free-to-play live service, for a game that needs players to keep playing, to keep spending, to make this a viable long-term live service that is able to cover the costs of maintaining a live service. And it's not just on PC where we're seeing these huge drops in player numbers. True Achievements, which runs its own Xbox gameplay chart taken by analyzing a pool of over 2 million Xbox player accounts, says the game's active player count has dropped to around 4% of what it was at launch, well outside the top 100 games played on Xbox, despite being essentially a free-to-play Smash Brothers with well-known Warner Brothers characters. That's not the most statistically accurate data per se, but it very much goes in line with what we're seeing in terms of the player base dipping on PC, on Steam, and just a huge percentage that's been lost here. And you can see what a stark contrast this is to a similar live service, Rawhalla, which is a free-to-play Smash Brothers like that occasionally brings in characters from other IPs. You can see that this is a game that's been out since back in 2014, and slowly but surely it's built up its player numbers, and you can see that it's been a constant increase. It's been relatively stable, and its numbers have only been going up. There has been a recent dip, but it's still bringing in, over 10,000 players every day, not too far off from its all-time peak. It's just a night and day difference. Rawhalla has established itself as a long-term IP, as a long-term live service. Even though Rawhalla is not necessarily the more popular IP in the sense that it doesn't have the more iconic characters that Multiversus does, but eventually Rawhalla got into a rhythm, and it's been consistent about its content releases, about its updates, about the way it handles its live service, and so it's established itself, and as long as they keep that ball going, it's possible for this live service to survive. Whereas Multiversus has failed to stand out in an oversaturated market, failed to retain people's interest because of the way it's been poorly handling both communication and consistent high-quality content rollout. And so in the same way that the Avengers name couldn't carry Marvel's Avengers' poor, boring gameplay and design and just poor implementation of live service, these major names, these incredibly well-known and iconic characters aren't able to carry Multiversus because the foundation just hasn't been built upon in a compelling way. It's not enough anymore to do the bare minimum for a live service to keep it alive. You have to go above and beyond to compete against the established live services that have grounded their roots on this genre that is becoming more and more competitive and less viable as more live services saturate a market that expects players to have infinite time and that expects there to be infinite players, which is just an unsustainable model. We'll see what the future holds. I'm not saying this is the end for Multiversus, but Season 3 really has to be a knockout. The lineup of characters has to be compelling and extensive, and the rollout of those characters and the rollout of new stages, new content in general just has to be at the top of their game, and again, has to go above and beyond. They can't go mid with this, especially in this critical moment where the player base has dipped so much that it is very much in it might die off stages. But I suppose only time will tell what the future holds for Multiversus. It'd be a shame to see this game go down in flames because, again, the character lineup that can exist within this universe and just the foundation of the gameplay, there's potential for this game to achieve greatness, but when you're not able to keep up with your own schedule, with your, seasons and all these things, and with the player's patience, then yeah, you're going to get a losing live service that is just going to drive players away. It's going to make players want to spend their very limited time on just more established, better run live services. But we'll see what happens until we find out more about the fate of Multiversus and until we find out more about what its future plans are. Let me know in the comments below what your thoughts and opinions are on this game. Did you play it? And if you're one of those players who played it and then just hasn't gone back to it, what's your reasoning behind why you decided to leave this game and why you haven't touched it since? And do you think there's hope for this game? Do you think there's a chance that it can make a comeback? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.